When JD Vance raised his accusation, it wasn't shouted or laced with anger. It was carefully phrased, as if to make his point sound reasonable. He suggested that some members of Congress seemed more interested in creating attention-grabbing moments than in doing the slow, serious work of governing. It was the kind of comment that carried a quiet sting, one that could easily be brushed off, or, in the right hands, turned into something more meaningful. Jasmine Crockett chose the latter. She didn't rush to speak. For a brief moment, she just looked at him, taking in his words with the kind of measured calm that often says more than an instant rebuttal ever could. The room was still, the air thick with that familiar tension that fills political hearings when two sharp minds meet across party lines. JD Vance leaned back slightly, waiting for her response, perhaps expecting a defensive reaction or a rehearsed retort. But what came next wasn't defensive, and it certainly wasn't rehearsed. Crockett began slowly, her voice even and grounded. She acknowledged the accusation, but she didn't let it define the exchange. Instead, she redirected it. Senador Vance, she said evenly, when you call passion performative, you reduce real pain to theater. The line landed quietly but powerfully. It wasn't the volume that gave it weight. It was the truth underneath it. She went on to explain that the people she represents don't have the luxury of viewing political debates as spectacles. For them, she said, the issues debated in that room weren't abstractions, they were daily realities. JD Vance watched her closely, his usual composure meeting hers in a rare moment of mutual recognition. She wasn't attacking him. She was reframing his entire point. What he called performance, she was defining as purpose. It was a subtle but significant shift. By speaking in that way, she turned the moment from a confrontation into a clarification, a teaching moment not just for him, but for everyone watching. Her words carried examples, not slogans. She talked about single mothers struggling to keep their homes, veterans navigating a complicated benefits system, families living paycheck to paycheck while still hoping for a better future. When I raise my voice, she continued, it's not for applause. It's because someone out there doesn't have the microphone I have. That statement, quiet and sincere, reframed the entire tone of the discussion. JD Vance, to his credit, didn't interrupt. He listened, and that was part of what made the moment so striking. It wasn't a political argument spiraling into noise, but a pause that revealed something more human underneath the exchange. Crockett wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was simply clarifying the difference between performance and conviction. There was a moment, subtle but noticeable, where his expression softened, not necessarily agreement, but recognition. He had made his point about performative outrage, but now he was seeing the other side of it. That passion, when rooted in lived experience, doesn't need to be performative to be powerful. Crockett then drew the line even more clearly. We don't all come to this building from the same story, she said, but we all come here to fight for someone. It was an acknowledgement that beneath the surface of political sparring lies a shared intent, even if methods differ. Her tone remained composed, but her words carried quiet conviction. In just a few sentences, she had done what most politicians spend entire speeches trying to do. She reminded her audience why she was there, and in doing so, she also reminded JD Vance, and perhaps everyone else in the room, that authenticity doesn't always look polished or performative. Sometimes it looks raw, even uncomfortable, but it is always real. What made the moment memorable wasn't that she defeated his argument, but that she transformed it. JD Vance's accusation became the foundation for a larger truth that advocacy and authenticity are not the same as theatrics, and that empathy and leadership should never be mistaken for performance. Crockett's words didn't just respond to his critique, they redefined it entirely. That short exchange, just over 40 seconds, became a reminder that in politics, sincerity can be more disarming than strategy. JD Vance had given her an opening, and instead of taking it as an attack, she used it as an opportunity to show what conviction looks like when it's grounded in lived experience. It was the kind of moment that felt both spontaneous and precise, the kind that doesn't need to be rehearsed, because it comes from something genuine. And while the discussion soon moved on to other topics, the tone of the room had shifted. JD Vance had come prepared with an argument about performance, but Jasmine Crockett's response revealed a deeper layer, that sometimes a most powerful rebuttal isn't louder or longer. It's simply true. The remarkable thing about Jasmine Crockett's response to JD Vance wasn't its sharpness, it was its calm. In a space where raised voices and rehearsed outrage often dominate, she managed to stand out precisely because she didn't try to. When JD Vance made his accusation about performative behavior in Congress, it was worded carefully, but everyone in the room knew it carried a challenge. His tone was deliberate, confident, measured, and slightly skeptical as he questioned whether certain lawmakers were more focused on creating viral moments than contributing to serious policy discussions. It was a fair critique on the surface, but beneath it was an implication that struck at Crockett's style of advocacy, that her passion might be more about visibility than substance. The moment could have easily become a clash. Many politicians, faced with that kind of public jab, would meet force with force, an interruption, a counterattack, or a cutting remark meant to win the headline. But Crockett didn't take the bait. She waited until JD Vance had finished speaking, and only then began her reply. Her tone was deliberate, not defensive. The first few seconds were enough to signal that this wouldn't be the typical exchange people expected to see in such hearings. Asterisk, her calmness wasn't silence, it was control. It was the kind of composure that allows the message to carry itself without the noise of emotion getting in the way. JD Vance, who had positioned himself as the steady voice in the conversation, suddenly found that Crockett matched his poise, and then quietly redirected it. She didn't deny his point outright. Instead, she dissected it. "Sona door Vance," she said with quiet assurance. "When people see passion, they sometimes mistake it for performance. But I come from communities where silence never changed a thing." Asterisk, the way she phrased it flipped the entire tone of the discussion. By speaking with restraint rather than heat, she demonstrated that clarity could dismantle an argument faster than confrontation ever could. Every word she chose seemed intentional, grounded not in rhetoric but in experience. The power of her 42-second response came from that, not from emotional display, but from precision. Asterisk, JD Vance, listening intently, didn't interrupt. Perhaps he expected the exchange to escalate. Instead, it leveled out. Her tone forced the conversation to stay grounded in meaning rather than spectacle. That's what made it so effective. In a political climate where outrage often overshadows thought, her control became her strength. Asterisk, she went on to explain that caring deeply about the people you represent isn't a show, it's a duty, and she did it without raising her voice or gesturing for emphasis. There was something quietly persuasive in the way she spoke. The sincerity was evident, and it left little room for rebuttal. JD Vance's expression shifted slightly, not defensive, but contemplative, as if realizing that what was happening wasn't a counterattack at all, but a quiet correction. Asterisk, the room felt the change too. The tone had moved from accusation to understanding, from debate to dialogue. Crockett's words carried a subtle reminder that true conviction doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. In fact, the very calmness she displayed became the proof of her authenticity, the kind that no accusation of performance could undermine. Asterisk, JD Vance, who often prides himself on reasoned argument, seemed to recognize that he was witnessing another form of it. She was reasoning too, just through a different rhythm, one built on composure rather than confrontation. The silence after she spoke was telling. It wasn't the uneasy quiet that follows tension, but the stillness that follows clarity. Asterisk, her response showed how calm reasoning doesn't just de-escalate conflict, it transforms it. Instead of letting JD Vance's critique define her, she defined the moment. She didn't reject his premise with emotion, she dismantled it with perspective. And in doing so, she showed that strength in communication isn't always about dominating the space, but about controlling its tone. Asterisk, even after she finished speaking, JD Vance didn't rush to reply. He paused, perhaps because there wasn't much to challenge. Her reasoning was to glean. Her delivery too balanced to provoke an easy counterpoint. That brief exchange became memorable not because it was heated, but because it was human. It reflected a rare kind of discipline, the ability to face criticism directly, respond without defensiveness, and still come away having shifted the entire narrative. Asterisk, in that 42-second window, Crockett reminded everyone, including JD Vance, that the quietest voices in a room can sometimes hold the most authority. Her calm wasn't passivity, it was power in its most refined form. By staying steady, she demonstrated that political strength doesn't have to be loud or aggressive to be effective. It can be poised, measured, and deeply persuasive. Asterisk, JD Vance's words had been designed to question her intent, but her composure revealed her integrity. In politics, perception often overshadows truth, yet in that moment, truth spoke softly, and it was impossible to ignore. JD Vance's challenge during the hearing wasn't delivered with hostility. It came from the steady tone he's known for, the kind of calm confidence that can make even a pointed remark sound like a reasonable observation. He was making a broader argument about how politics, in his view, had become too focused on sound bites and viral exchanges. But when he mentioned lawmakers who seem more interested in performance than progress, everyone in the room knew who he was referring to. Jasmine Crockett didn't need him to say her name. The implication hung in the air, polite but unmistakable. Asterisk, it was the kind of subtle challenge that politicians often throw into the conversation, not an outright attack, but a test. And for JD Vance, a skilled debater who's built his reputation on sharp analysis, it seemed like a moment to assert his narrative. But what he didn't anticipate was that his words would open the door for one of Jasmine Crockett's most composed and compelling responses to date. Asterisk, when she began to speak, her tone didn't shift the energy in the room immediately. It wasn't loud, it wasn't defiant. It was deliberate, slow, grounded, and clear. She began by acknowledging what he said, not rejecting it outright. "Senator Vance," she said evenly, "I hear your concern about performative politics. I share that concern, but the difference between us might be in what we call performance." It was an unexpected opening, not defensive, but thoughtful. JD Vance's expression changed slightly, showing that he was listening. Crockett continued, explaining that for some people, raising one's voice or showing visible passion isn't performance. It's part of fighting to be heard in systems that often ignore them. She spoke of the communities she represents, places where injustice isn't theoretical, where people don't have lobbyists or platforms, where advocacy sometimes has to be loud just to be noticed. Her words didn't accuse him. They illuminated the limits of his point. JD Vance had made his challenge, but Crockett had turned it into an opening to clarify something deeper about representation and authenticity. The remarkable part was how she managed to stay composed the entire time. She didn't try to win the exchange by overpowering him. She won it by grounding it. As she spoke, she pointed out that passion and seriousness aren't opposites, they're often intertwined. When I speak strongly, she said, it's not because I'm trying to go viral. It's because the issues are real to me and to the people I serve. Her phrasing carried weight, not because it was rehearsed, but because it sounded like it came from lived experience. There was no theatrics, no exaggerated emotion, just sincerity. JD Vance sat back, hands folded, as she continued. The exchange had shifted from confrontation to perspective. He had offered a critique of political showmanship, and she had responded by humanizing the very emotion he was calling performative. Her calm made it hard to dismiss her point. In fact, it forced a moment of reflection, both in the room and among those watching later. That's what made her response so striking. It didn't feel like a cut. It felt like balance. Crockett wasn't trying to dominate JD Vance. She was showing him another angle. Her approach made the moment memorable precisely because it lacked aggression. The clarity and control with which she spoke revealed that passion doesn't have to come at the expense of composure. By the time she finished, the power dynamic of the conversation had quietly flipped. JD Vance, who started with the upper hand, found himself listening more than talking. She had taken his challenge, his subtle accusation of showmanship, and transformed it into a statement about purpose. What began as a critique of style had become a discussion about substance. Even those who disagreed with her politically could see that something meaningful had just happened. It wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about communication, how conviction, when rooted in truth, can disarm even the most carefully framed criticism. JD Vance's words had been calculated to question motive, but her reply reframed motive as mission. The moment lasted less than a minute, but it resonated long after. Viewers who later replayed the clip noticed how JD Vance seemed to nod slightly as she spoke, a subtle acknowledgement, not of defeat, but of understanding. He had given her an opening, perhaps without realizing it, and she used it to articulate something that transcended their disagreement. What she demonstrated, in those few seconds, was that sometimes opposition doesn't need to be crushed. It needs to be met with calm reasoning that brings a new kind of clarity. JD Vance's challenge was meant to expose her, but instead it revealed her strength. She didn't just defend herself, she expanded the conversation beyond his accusation, showing that authenticity in leadership isn't about how loudly one speaks, but how deeply one means what they say. When the exchange between JD Vance and Jasmine Crockett unfolded, it didn't erupt into the kind of heated argument many expected. There was no shouting, no back-and-forth interruptions, no scramble to dominate the air in the room. What stood out was something simpler, almost refreshing, a kind of quiet clarity that seemed to reset the tone of the entire discussion. JD Vance had come prepared with a pointed line of questioning, built around the idea that modern politics had become more about spectacle than service. It was a criticism that sounded polished and practiced, and he delivered it with his usual calm confidence. But when Jasmine Crockett responded, she didn't match his tone to outdo him. She matched it to ground the conversation in something real. Her words didn't come out as a speech. They came out as a reflection. Vance, she began softly. Sometimes clarity looks like confrontation, but it's really just honesty. That single line reframed everything that followed. Instead of arguing, she clarified. Instead of pushing back with emotion, she peeled back the assumptions behind his statement. Her composure gave her words more weight than volume ever could. JD Vance had intended to make a broader statement about performative behavior in Congress, but her calmness turned his critique into an opportunity for understanding. She didn't rush to prove him wrong, she let her reasoning speak for itself. Every point she made was rooted in logic and sincerity. She explained that for many lawmakers, especially those representing struggling communities, raising issues passionately isn't for attention, it's for awareness. The things I talk about aren't theoretical, she said. They come from real people who trust me to be their voice. It was a simple truth, and yet it cut through the political noise that often clouds such exchanges. JD Vance listened carefully, his expression steady but thoughtful. He wasn't being dismantled by rhetoric, he was being disarmed by reason. There was a kind of grace in how the moment unfolded, where clarity replaced combat. As Crockett spoke, she didn't just address his accusation. She also acknowledged his concern. You're right that politics shouldn't be about performance, she said, but it also shouldn't be about silence. Speaking clearly about hard truths isn't a show, it's the work. Her tone was gentle but firm. and her calm presence made her words impossible to dismiss. She wasn't arguing to win. She was speaking to be understood. That distinction changed everything. The room, which had been charged with quiet tension, settled into stillness. The moderator didn't need to step in. No one interrupted. For a few moments it wasn't about partisanship or political posturing. It was about perspective. Crockett's clarity had shifted the focus from accusation to reflection. JD Vance, often known for his directness, seemed to recognize that. He didn't push back immediately, and that pause, that moment of stillness, became its own kind of acknowledgement. He had raised an important question about integrity in politics, but her calm reasoning showed that integrity doesn't always look the same on everyone. For some, it's quiet consistency. For others, it's passionate urgency. Both can be genuine. Crockett's response wasn't emotional, but it was deeply human. She talked about the people who couldn't afford to be quiet, those who needed their struggles spoken aloud in rooms that might otherwise ignore them. When I speak, she said, it's not about me. It's about the people who don't get invited into this room. That line carried a kind of moral precision that no amount of argument could touch. It wasn't grandstanding. It was truth stated plainly. Her words had the effect of softening the entire tone of the conversation. JD Vance didn't appear defeated. He appeared reflective. The exchange had gone from a challenge to a moment of mutual recognition, and that's what made it so powerful. Clarity had won, not because it silenced him, but because it made both sides, and everyone listening, reconsider what political communication could look like when it's stripped of ego and noise. In just 42 seconds, Crockett showed that calm reasoning and genuine understanding could outshine even the most carefully crafted critique. Her clarity didn't just respond to JD Vance's words, it illuminated them, revealing their intent without attacking their speaker. And in that way, her composure became the very thing that commanded respect. It's rare in modern politics to see a moment where disagreement doesn't descend into spectacle. But that's exactly what happened here. Crockett's clarity didn't humiliate or provoke. It simply clarified. And in doing so, it reminded everyone watching, including JD Vance himself, that the most persuasive moments often come not from force, but from focus. When the hearing concluded, it was clear that something rare had taken place. Not just another tense political exchange, but a reminder of what thoughtful discourse can look like. Jasmine Crockett and JD Vance had entered the discussion from two very different perspectives, each with their own convictions and approach to public service. Yet what made their moment stand out wasn't who spoke louder or who won the debate. It was how a few seconds of clarity reshaped the atmosphere of an entire conversation. In an environment where every pause, every gesture, and every word can be spun into partisan theater, both of them managed to demonstrate restraint. JD Vance, known for his sharp reasoning and measured tone, raised a valid concern that politics too often leans toward performance rather than progress. It's a sentiment shared by many Americans who have grown weary of political grandstanding. But when he delivered that point toward Jasmine Crockett, it triggered something deeper than a rebuttal. It became a chance for reflection, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Crockett's response, lasting just 42 seconds, didn't rely on force or volume. It relied on presence. She didn't reject his words outright. She reframed them, showing that passion and authenticity can coexist with professionalism and reason. Her calm, deliberate tone didn't just quiet the room, it commanded it. She turned a potential confrontation into a conversation about meaning, about why people choose to serve, and about the fine line between advocacy and performance. There was something timeless in that brief exchange. It recalled a time when disagreement in politics didn't automatically mean disrespect. JD Vance and Jasmine Crockett clearly come from opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, yet their moment of mutual recognition showed that clarity can transcend partisanship. It was a reminder that public service, at its best, is not about spectacle, it's about understanding. When viewers watched the clip later, the response wasn't centered on division or outrage, but on appreciation for the tone itself. Many commented that it was refreshing to see two strong personalities engage without the usual shouting match that defines political media. Others noticed how Crockett's composure seemed to soften even Vance's posture, turning what could have been a viral clash into a meaningful exchange. And that's the lesson that lingers from that moment. Clarity outlasts confrontation. Crockett's measured words didn't erase JD Vance's point, they deepened it. She didn't deny the need for serious, focused leadership. She simply reminded everyone that compassion is part of that seriousness. It's not performance to care deeply. It's responsibility. By the end of that hearing, the noise of politics had briefly faded, replaced by something more valuable, perspective. JD Vance's challenge and Jasmine Crockett's response together created a rare moment of balance, where reason met authenticity, and both held their ground. It was proof that even in today's divided climate, clarity, honesty, and calm conviction can still carry